Okay, so basically what we're going to be talking about is what is biblical marriage, and it's a very broad topic, so, obviously we won't be able to touch on everything in one meeting, as usual, but, and we might just kind of focus on it for this meeting, and then tonight discuss another very misunderstood subject, specification. And but first, we're going to discuss this whole topic of marriage. And if anyone at any point has anything to interject, by all means, feel free, and hopefully I'll be able to hear you fine. And if anyone's at a computer and they have something, if you click the hand raise thing today, that might work better than anything else. So I actually wanted to start by reading something from the Symbolic Codes, because he talks about the restoration of the marriage institution. And even in his day, and there are things that he even says was not yet restored in his day. And usually when people just read this one section of the Symbolic Codes, it looks like it is restored, or whatever the case may be. But when you read the other things connected to it, it's clear that he's saying that it is something yet future, and that in his day there are certain things that, he was saying that they just simply didn't understand. And now these things are being made clear, and it's somewhat surprising, but yet it's very simple as to what it actually is and the rest of it. So I'll just from the get-go, I want to just, well, actually, we'll start with reading this one statement, and then I'll try to kind of just clarify a few things before we get into some of the other aspects. So this first thing here is actually from Symbolic Code Volume 3, number 2, and it's pages 4 to 8, and it's we're not going to read the entire section because the first part is kind of preliminary. It's just for anyone. It's Symbolic Code Volume 3, number 2, pages 4 to 8. And this we've discussed little tidbits of this before, but I want to read the full, or a larger portion of this section here. So this is on page 4, and here he's quoting from Patriarchs and Prophets, pages 44 to 47. And I won't read the very beginning, but it's talking about creation. And it mentions about the flowers and the different plants and the rest of it. And then she talks about Adam and how he was of great stature, and Adam and Eve were noble and full of beauty, and the rest of it. So in the 4th paragraph of what he's quoting here, it says, "After the creation of Adam, every living creature was brought before him to receive its name. He saw that to each had been given a companion, but among them there was not found an helpmeet for him. Among all the creatures that God had made on the earth, there was not one equal to man. And God said, 'It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him.' Man was not made to dwell in solitude. He was to be a social being. Without companionship," and I just want to point out that Ellen White uses the phrase companion and companionship many times. And I just noticed here, Teresa typed to give the reference again. So it's Volume 3, Symbolic Code, number 2, pages 4 to 8. And he starts off quoting Patriarchs and Prophets 44 to 47. So here, and I just want you guys to notice how she's using this term companion. You know, without companionship, the beautiful scenes and delightful employments of Eden would have failed to yield perfect happiness. Even communion with angels could not have satisfied his desire for sympathy and companionship. There was none of the same nature to love and to be loved. And just want to point out here, you know, everything that she's talking about here so far is before sin, before the fall. And so even before the fall, Adam, without having a companion to love and to be loved, and someone of his own nature to be one with, he would not have been able to, you know, experience that perfect happiness, even through communion with angels and the rest of it. So this is God's, you know, this is pre-sin. It says to not have satisfied his desire for sympathy and companionship. So needed one of his own nature to satisfy that desire. And it says God himself gave Adam a companion. He provided an helpmeet for him, a helper corresponding to him, one who is fitted to be his companion. And that's important there because that's giving us the understanding of what the term helpmeet actually means. It doesn't mean someone that's a helper in a subordinate sense or in the sense of a servant, you know, other than in the sense, you know, that we're all supposed to be servants one of another, but not as a lesser helper, but just someone that's as a perfect and fitting companion. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, that help meet for him. Is the word meet a noun or an adjective?
No, there's help meet. I'd have to go back, but Walter says fitting helper. But the help meet is one word, and I think in Hebrew it's one word. I'd have to go back and actually check the Hebrew. I didn't have time to do this.
Ebenezer.
Pardon?
Ebenezer.
Ebenezer. Right.
It's almost applying the term of it is called a lifesaver.
Lifesaver, right. In this paragraph, she kind of expands on that. We have, you know, help me, a companion, and then she, you know, you can see Ellen White's position on why she was taken from the side. And there's been different ways that people have looked at that. You know, lots of people say, oh, see, she was just taken from the man, so she was lesser because she was just one part of him. And then, you know, and these interpretations go back a long way. We have different views on this. But Ellen White's view, she expresses in this way. You know, one who is fitted to be his companion and who could be one with him in love and sympathy. Eve was created from a rib taken from the side of Adam, signifying that she was not to control him as the head, nor to be trampled under his feet as an inferior, but to stand by his side as an equal, to be loved and protected by him. A part of man, bone of his bone, and flesh of his flesh, she was his second self, showing the close union and affectionate attachment that should exist in this relation. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it. Therefore shall man leave his father and his mother, and so cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one. Continuing on, it says, so God celebrated the first marriage. Thus the institution has its originator, has for its originator the creator of the universe. Marriage is honorable. It was one of the first gifts of God to man. And it was one of the two institutions that after the fall, Adam brought with him beyond the gates of paradise. When the divine principles are recognized and obeyed in this relation, marriage is a blessing. It guards the purity and happiness of the race. It provides for man's social needs. It elevates the physical, the intellectual, and the moral nature. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Everything that God had made was the perfection of beauty, and nothing seemed wanting that could contribute to the happiness of the holy pair. Yet the Creator gave them still another token of his love by preparing a garden especially for their home. In this garden were trees of every variety, many of them laden with fragrant and delicious fruit. There were lovely vines growing upright, yet presenting a most graceful appearance, with their branches drooping under the load of tempting fruit of the richest and most varied hues. It was the work of Adam and Eve to train the branches of the vine to form bowers, thus making for themselves a dwelling from living trees covered with foliage and fruit. There were fragrant flowers of every bud in rich profusion. In the midst of the garden stood the tree of life, surpassing in glory all other trees. Its fruit appeared like apples of gold and silver, and had the power to perpetuate life. The creation was now complete. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Eden bloomed on earth. Adam and Eve had free access to the tree of life. No taint of sin or shadow of death marred the fair creation. The morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The great Jehovah had laid the foundations of the earth. He had dressed the whole world in a garb of beauty, and had filled it with things useful to man. He had created all the wonders of the land and of the sea. In 6 days the great work of creation had been accomplished, and God rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. God looked with satisfaction upon the work of his hands. All was perfect, worthy of its divine author, and he rested, not as one weary, but as well pleased with the fruits of his wisdom and goodness and the manifestations of his glory. After resting on the seventh day, God sanctified it, or set it apart, as a day of rest for man. Following the example of the Creator, man was to rest upon this sacred day, that as he should look upon the heavens and the earth, he might reflect upon God's great work of creation, and that as he should behold the evidences of God's wisdom and goodness, his heart might be filled with love and reverence for his Maker. And that's the end of the quote from Patriarchs and Prophets. And continuing on, Hoddock now comments. And he says, and it's really interesting the comments that he makes about this. He says, the foregoing paragraphs make it plain that the only sacred institutions brought forth from beautiful Eden are the institution of marriage and the institution of the Sabbath, home and rest. Marriage, the home, Sabbath, rest. And the formers being instituted the first of the two, and solely for the use and benefit of man, clearly shows that the Sabbath, as Christ declared to the Pharisees, was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2:27. Our parents, or our Eden parents, in celebrating the first Sabbath, not only commemorated God's completing the whole creation, but also their own marriage. So notice that the first Sabbath was not only a commemoration of creation, but it was also a celebration of marriage. Right? So that's it's another part of Sabbath that we should have in mind each Sabbath, that it's actually a celebration of marriage. And there's elsewhere, don't know if I have the quote, if it's part of this or if I just read it yesterday as I was looking up some other things connected with this, but Ellen White actually says that the purpose of the gospel is to restore the marriage. So now continuing on, Hoddock makes some interesting statements. He says, when Adam and Eve fell into sin, losing their beautiful garments of light, they lost dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, besides possession of their Eden home and access to the tree of life. That's Genesis 1:26 and Genesis 3:24. Thus, when he sinned, Adam lost his dominion, surrendering all to Satan, whereupon unto the woman God said, then quotes Genesis 3:16-19, I'll greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying that thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, and dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. So, question, he says, now arises the question, when and how will the first dominion be restored? To which the scriptures answer, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to the fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with curse. Malachi 4:5-6. And Jesus said, Elias verily cometh first, and restoreth all things. That's Mark 9:12. Therefore, Elijah's coming must precede both the great and dreadful day of the Lord and his second coming. And when he comes, he must restore all things. So he's talking about the restoration of all things, focusing on the marriage. And it says here, Jesus' statement found in Mark 9:12 proves that before he appears the second time, someone, antitypical Elijah, cometh first and restoreth all things. Hence, the dominion and all that was lost must be restored in the time of Elijah's message. Yea, even the curses of the earth must then be removed. And then he goes on to quote Hosea 2, verses 18-19, Isaiah 11, 6-9, Isaiah 25, 8-9, Revelation 21, verse 4, Isaiah 66, 22-23, and Revelation 22, verses 1-4, which we won't read all now, but basically Hosea 2 is talking about making a covenant with the beasts of the field and so on. That's restoring that curse, or restoring what the curse had taken away. So the peace of the animals, same thing is in Isaiah 11, peace of the animals. And then just going on into the aspect of the new heavens and the new earth, showing that that's all part of the restoration. Now, he continues on after he quotes all those passages and says, the foregoing passages show that the message of antitypical Elijah shall bring again the dominion which Adam lost. And as far as the prophecies above mentioned are concerned, the only institution that apparently seems to remain in darkness as to its continuance and restoration, to its original sacredness, is the institution of marriage. So he quotes these verses, and the verses show all of those curses being restored, including, it talks about Sabbath, new moon, and the rest of that, and it has all these elements. So he's saying the only thing from at least those scriptures that is left in darkness as to its continuance and restoration to its original sacredness is the institution of marriage. Then his comment is very, he continues on to explain what he's talking about. And this is something that all Davidians need to understand, but unfortunately, I think a lot of Davidians miss it. And I missed it for quite a while, too. So this is what he says. He says, but how could the Lord possibly allow himself, during the very time in which all things must be restored, to annul the first of all institutions, which he himself instituted, the crowning act of the creation week, or the week of creation, and in favor of which he said, it is not good that man should be alone. Moreover, how could the word say that Elijah must restore all things if he were not also going to restore the marriage institution? Furthermore, if God saw that it was not good for man to be alone originally in the Garden of Eden, then why should it be good for him when he returns to Eden? Or shall we now, in this time of gathering and receiving the inheritance of the first dominion, divorce our wives? Right? So here he's saying, hey, well, if Elijah's to restore all things, marriage must be restored as well. And if in the original Eden it was said it is not good to be alone, so must be in Eden restored. And here's just a question. Since the Sabbath had to be restored, what does that imply? Why is it the Sabbath had to be restored? Any thoughts?
Because it had been lost.
It had been lost, yeah. Same thing with the feast days, right? The feast days had to be restored because they were lost. Eden has to be restored because it was lost. You know, every divine institution, the reason why it needed to be restored is because it was lost, and all that remained of it was a perversion of it, right? And when you read a lot of what Ellen White says about marriage, you see how much she talks about how it was perverted. And so basically, just to continue on with Hoddif's comments here, it's just important to keep that in mind that, wait a second, if it needs to be restored, it must be that it was lost and perverted. So, continuing, it says, if the redeeming of the saints must spell divorce for them, why then should God compose the kingdom of both sexes? Mm-hmm. Which is interesting because here he's taking it for granted that the kingdom will have both sexes, whereas most Christians kind of assume that we'll be genderless. You know? Mm-hmm. I'm just saying most Christians believe that we'll be beyond gender. Yeah. And they base that off of Christ's discussion with the Sadducees, where it said that we will be as the angels, and they assume that angels have no gender, and therefore we will have no gender. And actually, even Davidians, I was having some recent discussions with Davidians, in which even they were saying we're going to have no gender because we're going to be as the angels. And so, but here Hoddif is saying, hey, the kingdom is going to be composed of both sexes, so, you know, why would God divorce them if they're going to have gender? And the purpose of that, again, is why, if we are going to have these physical body parts, why would we have them for eternity to just sit there and be not put to use? You know, that's a question. If we are going to have gender, why, you know, what is the point if those bodily organs are not going to be put to use? And this is kind of the reasoning that Hoddif is dealing with when he says, you know. Was somebody trying to say something here?
Yeah, I was going to interject something. That's why a lot of people have a hard time believing that God the Father and the Holy Spirit are male and female, because that would mean that they have male and female body parts. And if they have body parts, then they would be for use. But, that could never happen because, you know, sexual intimacy is evil. You know, and that's Gnostic. Isn't that a Gnostic teaching?
It's a Gnostic teaching. It comes from Neoplatonism.
And isn't it ironic that the very people who are saying, well, they that sex is bad. That the God would never get involved in something like that because they would never do that. They're the same ones that are claiming that anyone who believes that the Holy Spirit is female is teaching Gnosticism.
Yeah, no.
It's just the
It's
opposite.
really twisted around. And it is, it does have that irony for sure. Because, and people don't even realize where that came from. Because the reason why the Gnostics believe that is they were looking at this problem of suffering. And the conclusion that they came to is the reason why we suffer is because everything that we know is physical, and everything is, basically, they didn't like life. Life wasn't too good, and everything that we know is physical. Therefore, this physical world must be evil. And the one who made this physical world must be evil. So they said that Jehovah or Yahweh was evil. And that those who claimed to be Christian Gnostics said that Jesus came to free us from the God of the Old Testament, which is, they became very anti-Semitic, anti-Torah, and the rest of that. And that Gnosticism came in, the Gnostics got a lot of their beliefs from Plato, right? So a lot of Greek philosophy. And there's the guy, Augustine of Hippo, and he was a Manichaean Gnostic. And then he converted to Christianity, but he brought a lot of that Gnosticism with him, and he said that sex is evil, even sex between a husband and wife is the most wicked act because they believe in the doctrine of original sin, which is basically, Augustine proposed the thought that humanity, it's called, total deprivation. Humanity is so evil that we cannot even choose good, that our free will has been destroyed. We no longer have free will because we have been so thoroughly corrupted with sin that our free will is even no longer in function. And that's the first point of Calvinism, because, if we can't choose, then God has to choose for us, And then God chooses who he's going to choose, and obviously those who go to hell were simply not chosen by God to be saved. And that's limited atonement and the rest of that, where people say Jesus only died for the elect and so on, and that everyone else just wasn't part of that. So the whole thing, it really goes back to at least entering into Christianity through Augustine, and that, by the way, Augustine as well is the first one to demonize the book of Enoch and bring in the doctrine of everlasting punishment and plenty more things. But, it's important to understand that the way that it came into Christianity was not through the apostles, it was through Gnosticism. And Hoddoff actually addresses this whole thing of thinking that sex is evil. But, continuing on, he says, would Adam, who chose to die rather than depart from Eve, enjoy life if, upon returning to his Eden home, his wife should be missing, or if he should then have to divorce her? So notice something here. Here he's talking about things in terms of Adam, and would Adam have to divorce Eve? So obviously Adam's not coming up until the first resurrection. And so this isn't premillennial kingdom, he's talking about the kingdom overall. And so, continuing on here, he says, furthermore, the scriptures say of Elijah that he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers. Malachi 4:6. Hence, both the foregoing scripture and Joel 2:16, which says, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children, and those that suck breast, prove that Elijah's message is to unite families, not separate them. So this whole separation thing. And he says, the Spirit of God revealed to Paul that in the latter days, evil spirits would attempt to overthrow God's plan for his people. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly, that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, forbidding to marry. And that's 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 and 3. Whereas we need no doctrine that would forbid marrying, we do need to know why we marry and how to live. Hence, we need a thorough reformation, a change in ideas and theories, habits and practices. That's Christ Our Righteousness, page 154. So notice he's talking about this in context of marriage. He says we need to know why we marry, implying that it's something that was unknown and still is unknown by the great majority. And in this context of marriage, he says we need a thorough reformation, a change in ideas and theories, habits, and practices. And we need to keep this in mind because today, after we get done with this quote, and one more quick thing from Hoddeth, in the discussion of marriage here, there's going to be some things that are very contrary to what mainstream Christianity is teaching and very contrary to even what we have understood up to this point. And in one sense, it's surprising, but in another sense, I think that everyone here will be able to understand it in its proper light. So we'll touch more on that after we're done this quote. But the Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they were no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So we have Christ referring back to the Edenic experience, right? What happened in Eden. Now this part is where he says, just as Satan has perverted the Sabbath day, so he has perverted the marriage relation. And therefore marriage is looked upon, even by most Christians, as something questionable, and in a way even evil and sinful, although, with but few exceptions, they all marry. Hence, though the word says, Whoso findeth wife findeth a good thing, and obtaineth favor of the Lord, Proverbs 18:32, most marriages prove to be a curse. Therefore, the fewer the marriages contracted, the better for all, both men and women. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 366. So notice the context in which he's putting that statement is because it has been perverted, right? So it's the perverted marriages that are not beneficial. And he says, in fact, the only marriages that God can honor are those which are entered upon only after both parties inquire of him and receive his sanction. Let me quote some more things from right here. Marriage affects the afterlife, both in this world and in the world to come. A sincere Christian will make no plans that God cannot approve. Ministry of Healing, page 359. Go ahead.
Yeah, just in case you were going to move on, were you going to comment on that quote before going on or not? Because I would like to.
Which one? The one that I just read?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was probably going to say something, but if you have something to say about it, please go right ahead.
Well, it just really stands out to me very much. And this symbolic code, man, I tell you what, I have studied this over the years big time. So I'm just glad that you're talking on this today. But I find it very interesting that even back in Ellen White's day, she was inspired to make the statement that marriage affects the afterlife
Mm-hmm.
in this world and in the world to come.
Right.
So, I mean, I have some ideas as to what she means by that, or what the spirit that inspired the statement meant by that. Are you going to expand on that?
Are you talking the aspect of the afterlife in this world and the afterlife in the world to come?
Yeah, well, the afterlife in this world, I think, is pretty obvious, because when you contract a marriage that isn't sanctioned by God, it's not the right person to marry, you're pretty miserable. And even if you have been given permission to get married and somebody then, takes a change of heart or whatever, or was deceptive in the first place, whew, then you really get to know somebody. But that seems obvious, but the marriage of the afterlife in the world to come, that implies that there's marriage in the world to come.
Well, it implies, the statement, I'll put it like this, what Hoddis is trying to say with this statement, or the thing that he's trying to at least use it to hint towards, is that, but someone could just read the statement from Ellen White and say marriage affects the afterlife, both in this world and the world to come. She also says that every decision that we make has eternal consequences, right? That affects, throughout all eternity. So someone could just take Ellen White's statement alone and have it not imply to them that there will be marriage in the afterlife, that it just marriage now affects the afterlife. Hoddis, the way he's using it though, and as we'll see, he makes it pretty clear, is using it to hint towards the idea that there will be marriage in the life to come. And he even goes as far as saying so. But was there any more comments on that particular quote or anything related to that?
No, it was just in regard to the implication of marriages in the world to come.
Right.
At least maybe, I'm not speculating on new marriages one way or the other, but that we will be paired up. And
right.
It's interesting that this is exactly what Hawkins is saying, and it's when you superimpose that over the statement by Jesus that we will be as the angels in heaven, it kind of makes you think if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals B.
Right. True enough.
So if there was a couple that was married.
I'd have to speak louder.
There was a couple that was married now that was not a right marriage, and so one righteous goes and then one isn't. So there's going to be a new marriage for that person that enters.
It would sure seem that they shouldn't be alone. And there's some other things relating to that, as we shall see continuing on. But let's see here. Yeah, there's a few more statements that he quotes here, one more from Ellen White, then a couple things from the Bible. It says, the family tie is the closest, the most tender and sacred of any on earth. It was designed to be a blessing to mankind, and it is a blessing wherever the marriage covenant is entered into intelligently, in the fear of God, and with due consideration for its responsibilities. And that's also from Ministry of Healing 356, 357. Thus, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. It's Hebrews 13:4. And he quotes 1 Timothy 3, verses 2 to 4, which says, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. Then Hoddeth continues on his discussion, and here he says a few things that are really key in this whole discussion. He says, however, as with the institution of Sabbath, so must God restore that of marriage. So earlier he said, just as Satan has perverted the Sabbath day, so he has perverted the marriage relation. He says, as with the institution of the Sabbath, so must God restore that of marriage. The words of Christ... Pardon?
I didn't understand you there. Do you mind saying that statement again, please?
Sure. Just a few paragraphs before, Potter said, just as Satan has perverted the Sabbath day, so, or just so, he has perverted the marriage relation, right? So just like he perverted the Sabbath, he perverted the marriage relation. And a few paragraphs later, Potter says, however, as with the Sabbath institution, so must God restore that of marriage. So just like the Sabbath must be restored, so marriage must be restored. So it's just the exact same thing for both of them. Both of them were perverted and trampled down by Satan, and both of them must be restored by God. Go ahead.
Hey, yeah. Is this something here just really stands out to me too? We know, okay, the Sabbath is to be restored, and we know the Sabbath is eternal.
Mm-hmm.
Why would God go to the trouble to restore marriage if it wasn't also to be eternal?
Right. True enough. And Hoddeth makes just that point. He actually says it point blank here and in one other place, which is very important to realize. And after we read these couple things, we have to define what marriage is. So he says here about the restoration of marriage, and then he refers to this whole discussion that Christ had with the Sadducees, and what he says about this. Even though he says that he didn't really understand what it means, he tells you that the truth of what Christ meant is something totally different than what people normally think. So this is what he says. He says, the words of Christ, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor give in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven, Matthew 22:30, reveal that we have lost sight of the true marriage institution. You guys notice that? Instead of, people usually read that from Christ and they think that it means that there will be no marriage in the afterlife, right? They'll neither marry nor give in marriage, but they'll be as the angels. But what he says that these words reveal that we have lost sight of the true marriage institution. So the question is Hoddeth right? And we're going to go and see what it really means. But then, the next sentence in the paragraph, he says, and as God has not yet fully made known to us the state of our future life, we are just now unable to fully comprehend either the marriage or the family relationship after the resurrection. So he says, in the paragraph, he says that Christ's words show us that we have lost sight of the true marriage institution. And then he says, God has not yet fully made it known, and that we are just now, 1937, unable to fully comprehend either the marriage or the family relationship after resurrection, which tells us a few things. One thing that it tells us is that what Christ was talking about in Matthew 22, verse 30, was not the true marriage institution, but he was pointing to it. What he was dealing with the Sadducees was the perversion of the marriage institution, or, if you will, it's basically just the lost form and the perverted form of that marriage institution. And so we know that, okay, so Christ is talking about something related to that, And we also can see that, according to the statement where he says, has not yet fully made known, shows that it will be fully made known to us. And according to the context of this whole thing, it would have to be made known by Elijah in the time of the restoration of all things, what the true state of marriage and family relationship after the resurrection is. And the other thing that is implied by the statement is he says that we are unable to fully comprehend the marriage or the family relationship after the resurrection, implies that there will be marriage and family relationship after the resurrection, but just that we don't comprehend fully what it is, right? So there's a number of things in that paragraph which should really stand out to us. And now our Heavenly Family is being, gracious enough to make it a lot more clear. And we'll see that as we discuss it here today. And the next statement also has a few important things in it. It says, upon the occasion of the Pharisees' questioning Christ. Go ahead.
Thanks, honey. I just thought I needed to interject something at this point before we go on, just for the sake of the recording. Because maybe down the road, when somebody else may be listening to this, they may get to this point and they may be thinking, man, this is nothing new. I've understood this for years. Speaking from experience, Chris pointed this symbolic code out to me before we ever got married. And he was pointing out how there's going to be marriage in the earth made new. We're not going to be divorcing our spouses. It's eternal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of people may just be looking at the surface truth that, oh, okay, well, there will be marriage and family relationships in the earth made new, and leave it at that, and think that they understand what the marriage relationship is. Right. But in case somebody gets to this point and they're tempted to just stop listening, thinking, I know everything already. What you're about to share has a lot more to do with the true nature of the marriage relationship than just the fact that it's going to be eternal.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. And I'll just to expand on that a little bit, I'll just mention this now. One of the things that's important to realize here isn't just that it's eternal, but that things that we have today as marriage, that is not the Edenic marriage. It is a different marriage. It's simply not the same thing. The Edenic marriage was basically lost and in need of restoration. And so there's a lot of differences between what we think of as marriage and what the true Edenic marriage is, right? There's a lot of differences. And that's what we're going to be going into. And so that aspect of it being eternal is just one aspect. And I just want to mention, too, in case anyone listens to this who isn't Davidian, they might be looking at this and saying, oh, well, that's not true. We aren't going to have marriages. What we're going to be looking at as we continue on here is showing in the Bible and showing the rest of that, showing from the words of Christ. First, that there's nothing in the Bible that would imply that there won't be marriage. Second, that there's a difference between the lost marriage and the restored marriage, and that there's more aspects, but I won't mention that quite yet, because we're almost done this quote, and then there's a few more things here. But Potiphar was already kind of pointing out here that Christ was talking about something different, that the true marriage institution has been all settled. Which, if there's a true marriage institution, it implies that there's something else that's not the true marriage institution. And that is what we have been saturated with in our societies. Now, what it says here in the next paragraph, it says, upon the occasion of the Pharisees questioning Christ, after their characteristic fashion, as touching the sacred institution of marriage, Jesus pointed his hearers back to the institution as ordained at creation. He referred them to the blessed days of Eden, when God pronounced all things very good. Then marriage and the Sabbath had their origin, twin institutions for the glory of God and the benefit of humanity. Then, as the Creator joined the hands of the holy pair in wedlock, saying, "A man shall leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one," Genesis 2:24, he enunciated the law of marriage for all the children of Adam to the close of time, and Hoddeth puts "close to the close of time" in italics, and he comments on that later in this paragraph, explaining what he understands that means. It says, "That which the eternal Father himself had pronounced good was the law of highest blessing and development for man." Amount of Blessings, page 99 and 100. Hoddeth, continuing on, says, "Furthermore, the fact that the doctrine that forbids marriages is a doctrine of devils, 1 Timothy 4:1-3, shows not only that marriage is an everlasting institution, but also that in the time of the restitution of all things, it is of great import. For were it not so, the devils would not waste a moment in attacking it." So there, of course, he is understanding Ellen White's statement to mean that marriage is an everlasting institution, and that it is of great import. Then he continues and says, "But from the opening of the great controversy, it has been Satan's studied effort to pervert the marriage institution, to weaken its obligations and lessen its sacredness. For in no sure way could he deface the image of God in man and open the door to misery and life." Patriarchs and Prophets 3:38. So as branches, we can understand the connections there between the image of God and marriage. And if we were originally made in the image of God, and if we're no longer to have marriage, then that would be defacing the image of God in us, right? So, Walter's pointing out maybe that's why we have such a rise now in the promotion of same-sex marriage.
Such a what?
Such a rise in the promotion of same-sex marriage. Yeah. Because, it defaces the image of God. So, and I just want to point out, it's not just that which defaces the image of God. There's plenty of heterosexual relationships that deface the image of God too, which is what we'll be getting into as well. And it says here, marriage was in God's order. It was one of the first institutions which he established. He gave special directions concerning this ordinance, clothing it with sanctity and beauty. But these directions were forgotten, and marriage was perverted and made to minister to passion. A similar condition of things exists now. That's also Patriarchs and Prophets, page 101. Okay, now this is the statement I referred to before, Mount of Blessings, page 100. "Like every other one of God's good gifts entrusted to the keeping of humanity, marriage has been perverted by sin. But it is the purpose of the gospel to restore its purity and beauty." So this thing about marriage is of supreme importance. It's very, very important. So this is coming to the end of what we're looking at here in this statement. It says, inspiration further says, "And he answered and told them, Elias verily cometh first and restoreth all things." Mark 9, verse 12. "In the time of the end, every divine institution is to be restored." Prophets and Kings 6:78. The foregoing passages make clear at least three main facts namely, one, the foregoing one, that the first institution which God ordained and established on earth was that of marriage, and that the second was that of the Sabbath. Two, that God intended that both of these institutions could endure intact. So here says the first point was that the first institution was marriage, and the second was the Sabbath. The second point is that God intended that both of these institutions should endure intact, right? And he said it was an everlasting institution. But that Satan has perverted and corrupted them. Until today, they retain but little of their pristine purity. And then the third point is that consequently, in the time of the end, God will send Elijah the prophet to restore not only both of these, but also all other desecrated divine institutions. And he goes on, he talks about this more, and there are a few other interesting things that he says that we talked about before. He talks about how the Lord will work in this last work in a manner very much out of the common order of things. And he says that the other kind of main point that he makes that we've talked about before is that before we go forth to proclaim the Sabbath more fully, we must lift up marriage. Right? So he makes those points, and, you know, it's pretty clear, and it makes sense. It's logical, and we can see that's restoration. Restoration is, I think Ellen White says restoration is the central theme of the Bible. Yeah. And so there's one other quick thing that I want to read from Hada before we get into this. Before we proclaim the Sabbath more fully, we must uplift the marriage. Yeah. Okay, so one other thing from Hada is from Answer Book, Volume 4. Let's see. Answer Book, Volume 4, page 77 and 78. And it's just two short paragraphs. So Answer Book, Volume 4, page 77 and 78. It says, only in such a Christian home is Christ's kingdom exemplified, and in thus reflecting the kingdom here, and he's talking, his whole discussion here is about marriage, and, you know, having the Christian home following the order of the gospel. So only in such a Christian home is Christ's kingdom exemplified, and in thus reflecting the kingdom here, all such homes will, when banded together collectively, make up the kingdom hereafter. So he says that our home, if we're following the instructions of the marriage institution in particular, as well as child rearing and the rest of it, but his particular focus was on marriage. If we have that, we are reflecting the kingdom, and that when all such homes that are reflecting the kingdom band together collectively, that will make up the kingdom hereafter. And he says, how important then that the mother and the father cooperate to the full in conducting the home altogether in Christ's way in order to ensure its existence both now and forevermore. Right? So you see there he says, you know, it will ensure its existence now and forevermore. He says, failure on the part of either the father or the mother to carry out these principles will wreck the home and scatter the family, not only for the present, but also for eternity. Whereas, careful practice of them will safeguard the family's prosperity and happiness in this world and ensure its eternal continuance in the world to come. Right? So you see that in both these sections of the Rod, Adolf is most definitely saying that marriage is an eternal thing and it will continue on eternally in the world to come. And so it's, you know, it's something that's a foundation that we need to realize. Now to the new stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is basically what we have to understand is that we have, basically what we want to look at now is what is biblical marriage. And what we're using as criteria for that is, what does the Bible or the writings of the inspired prophets that made up the Bible, what we are considering biblical marriage is what in the Bible is considered to be lawful marriage, right? Anything that in the Bible is not considered lawful marriage, we're not going to consider as biblical marriage. Everything in the Bible that is considered lawful marriage, we're going to consider biblical marriage, right? Now, as we do this, there's going to be some things here that are going to kind of be, it might grind us in the wrong way, but it's important to understand that just because something is a biblical marriage, we're going to ask ourselves, is that what we are called to, or are we called to something more? Okay, so anyways, just ask our sister about these things. And it's not, there's nothing that I'm going to say that is going to be promoting something that is not in harmony with our Heavenly Family's will.
Mm-hmm.
So just keep that in mind. So one of the first marriage that we see, and I'll mention this first. The first that we see is Genesis 1 and 2, right? And this is the Edenic marriage. And so far as I know, there's actually nowhere in the Bible that refers to that as marriage, that refers to what happened with Adam and Eve, or Adam, masculine and feminine. I don't know of anywhere in the Bible that refers to that as marriage, which is just important to keep in mind for something a little bit later down the road. I'm not saying that it's not marriage, depending on how you define it, but as far as I know, there's nowhere in the Bible that refers to that as marriage. So we have this whole thing in Genesis, which we won't read right now, but we'll probably come back to it. We're familiar with the basic idea, though, that the male was there, and God said it is not good for man to be alone. And so a companion was made for him, just like we were reading from Patriarchs and Prophets. And that companion was to be equal. So the two were equal. They were both given dominion. And yeah, it was taken for granted that they were to be eternal companions. Because even before the woman was made, she was being made to be his companion, to be his helpmate. And so it was taken for granted. There was no ceremony. There was nothing like that. And it wasn't that Adam asked for her. It wasn't that they sought each other out. It wasn't anything like that. It was simply ordained of our Heavenly Family, and they were inspired with love one for another. And that's, Walt and I were talking about this yesterday, and that's how he put it about being inspired with love. And that's exactly what it is. And the thing that's really cool to understand, too, is that love is the love of and from our Heavenly Family. It's inspired love. And it's love that they give to us to have us actually have it. They give it to us, and it's a gift. And Ellen White talks about, even with the truth, she says we're to make the truth our own. We're to become part of it, and it is to become part of us. So that's the same thing with inspired love, right? Just wanted to mention that so we don't think it's just something that's our Heavenly Family inspires us, and it's their love just kind of funneling through us without our own individuality becoming affected by it, right? It's becoming, and putting it in terms of the here and now, becoming a new creation in Christ. and receiving life from our Heavenly Family, it is a life of love, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, to continue on here with some of these things, what we find very quickly in reading the Bible, and we won't go through all of this right away, but we find very quickly that original marriage institution becoming something very different. And we won't go through all the stuff with Lamech and all that right now, but we're going to kind of skip ahead to Genesis 38. And this is talking about Judah. And before that, I'll just mention something. We're all familiar with Genesis 16 and Abraham and Sarah and, or, you know, Abram and Sarai. And they had their marriage, and Sarai had her servant Hagar, and she couldn't bear a child, so she gave Hagar to Abram for a wife. And so you have this whole thing kind of happening. And so, but she was considered a wife. Now, this next thing here is from Genesis 38, starting at verse 6, and it's talking about Judah. And this is described just after Joseph was sold into slavery. So Genesis 38:6, it says, "And Judah took a wife for his firstborn. His name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. And Judah said unto Onan," which was his second son, "Go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother." And Onan knew that the seed should not be his. And it came to pass, when he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled it on the ground, lest that he should give seed to his brother. And the thing which he did displease the Lord, wherefore he slew him also. Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah, my son, be grown." For he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. And, you know, the purpose of this isn't to go through the whole story, although I do encourage everyone to read all of Genesis 38 because the whole story does have relevance in terms of marriage and what is biblical marriage. But these verses are kind of, they give us the picture. And this is called a levirate marriage. And levirate is just a word, it's spelled Leviraete, levirate. And what it is, it's from the Latin word levir, which means brother-in-law. And a levirate marriage is where the brother marries the wife of his deceased brother.
Right.
And you see the same thing in Deuteronomy 25. It says, starting at verse 5, Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10. It says, "If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. And if the man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders, and say, My husband's brother refuseth to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak unto him. And if he stand to it and say, I like not to take her, then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders, and loose his shoe from off his foot, and spit in his face, and shall answer and say, So shall it be done unto that man that will not build up his brother's house, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. So there we have the actual, encoded law of the Levirate marriage. Right? We saw the thing with Judah, which was, of course, before the time of Moses, and then through Moses was given this as a law. And this is something that continued on. And, this is most certainly a biblical marriage, right? Now the question is this the Edenic marriage, right? Because here's a question, what is the stated point of the brother taking the wife of his deceased brother?
Mm-hmm.
You want to speak louder?
Oh, to continue his name in Israel.
Right. To continue his name, to continue the lineage, and,
Mm-hmm.
So was that the purpose of the Edenic marriage? Maybe just keep that in mind. No, right? It wasn't the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And also, do you think that every instance of that happening, do you think that the husband will love the wife and the wife will love the husband? No, right? It wasn't for that purpose. And it wasn't this whole thing of being eternal companions together, right? Mm-hmm. And also the husband may have already had a wife, mm-hmm. which is another story. Mm-hmm. But we'll get into that. And, there is something that happens here as society changes. And there's a few elements to this that are important, but basically we see very quickly after Eden, we see things changing. We see, of course, marriage was corrupted greatly before the flood, right? Talks about they were marrying and given in marriage. Mm. And there's a place where Ellen White, she says, there's nothing wrong with eating, and there's nothing wrong with drinking, and there's nothing wrong with marrying and giving in marriage. But it was the perverted version of these things that was condemned, right? And that's when, of course, Christ refers to, before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. So according to Ellen White, there, he wasn't referring to eating itself, drinking itself, marrying itself, and giving marriage itself. He was referring to the corrupted version of those things, which we'll keep in mind because there's only one other time where Christ used the phrase marrying and giving in marriage, and that's when he was talking to the Sadducees. Now, so we have as biblical marriage this Levirate marriage, right? Which isn't the Edenic marriage, but it's a biblical marriage. So right now we're already seeing there's a distinction between biblical marriage and the restored Edenic marriage. Mm. And we also see that what happened with Abraham, taking unto him Sarah and Hagar, that was a biblical marriage, right? Mm-hmm. It's in the Bible, it was considered marriage. Mm-hmm. It was not considered unlawful. Genesis 26, he was said to obey all of God's commandments, statutes, and judgments, and the rest of it. It wasn't considered unlawful. So it's a biblical marriage. And before that, you also had Lamech, who was the first one to take unto himself more than one wife. And basically, we see after Eden, we see, this whole thing with before the flood, marriage was corrupted, and they were doing things that certainly were not in the order of things. And Ellen White talks about polygamy, and the Bible talks about polygamy, and the rest of that happening before the flood. And then after the flood, we saw Noah and his family. And then soon after that is, you see the nation is divided, and then you have Abraham, right? And right away, Abraham goes and he is married to Sarah and to Hagar. And those both were considered lawful biblical marriages. However, it wasn't the Edenic marriage, right? Which is really important to keep in mind. And the society that they lived in at that time was a nomadic type of society. And that's also where you see the levirate marriage come in, right? Now, after they went into Egypt, and they were there for 215 years, they came out, and here they are, they're Israel now, they're still wandering, like, you know, kind of nomadic, but now it's on a bigger scale, they're as a nation. And then you have this whole time of Canaan conquest and the time of the judges. And that time, of course, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And it was almost, there was no big government, and there was no, you know, there wasn't like a monarchy or anything like that. It was kind of different. And what we see in the time of Ruth, in the story of Ruth, what we see is it's during the time of the judges, and the whole thing is being kind of frustrated in the way that they are living. And they are still operating under the system of levirate marriage, right? And there are other laws there that we'll go back to in Deuteronomy and Exodus and the rest of it that relate to marriage, but just wanted to mention this in terms of Ruth.
You cut out Deuteronomy and what and the rest of it?
And Exodus.
Exodus.
I was just saying that we'll get back to some of the more specifics there. Actually, no, maybe we'll do that first. We'll go to some of these passages first in Deuteronomy and Exodus and see what biblical marriage was, you know, at the time of Sinai and what was really happening there. So another marriage that we find that is a biblical marriage is Deuteronomy 22, starting at verse 13. And it's a marriage to a virgin, and this is kind of what it says about it. And there's other things that kind of mentions a few different scenarios, but Deuteronomy 22, starting at verse 13, and it's 13 to 21 that we'll be reading right now. It says, "If any man take a wife, and go in unto her, and hate her, and give occasion of speech against her, and bring up an evil name upon her, and say, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I found her not a maid, or not a virgin, then shall the father of the damsel and her mother take and bring forth the tokens of the damsel's virginity unto the elders of the city in the gate. And the damsel's father shall say unto the elders, I gave my daughter unto this man to wife, and he hated her. And lo, he hath given occasions of speech against her, saying, I have found not thy daughter a maid, and yet these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city. And the elders of the city shall take that man and chastise him. And they shall immerse him in 100 shekels of silver, and give them unto the father of the damsel, because he hath brought up an evil name upon the virgin of Israel, a virgin of Israel. And she shall be his wife, he may not put her away all his days. But if this thing be true, the tokens of virginity be not found for the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel to the door of the father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones, that she die, because she has wrought folly in Israel, to play the whore in her father's house. So shalt thou put evil away from among you. So there you have this whole thing of the tokens of virginity, and you have the situation of even a man going into his wife and not finding pleasure in her or hating her, and bringing an accusation against her. If it turns out that he was falsely accusing her, then they're supposed to remain married. Kind of interesting. If he was lying, they remain married. And that is a lawful biblical marriage. Now, is that the Edenic marriage? You know, that's not joy, happiness, peace, love, restoration, wholeness. That's not safe sex, holy sex, you know? But it's biblical marriage. So we're going to continue on to a couple other passages. Next is continuing on in the same place. And this is dealing with slightly different marriage laws, and it has to do with rape and some other things. But Deuteronomy 22, verses 22 to 27. It says, if a man be found lying with a woman married to an husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So shalt thou put away evil from Israel. So that's adultery, you know, a man laying with another man's wife. If a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed to a husband, and a man find her in the city and lie with her, then ye shall bring them both out of the gate of the city, and ye shall stone them with stones that they die. The damsel, because she cried not, being in the city, and the man, because he hath humbled his neighbor's wife. So thou shalt put away evil from among you. So again, that's another situation of adultery, but it's interesting because she's betrothed to a man, but yet she's still, even in the betrothal, she is considered his wife, which is an interesting thing. It's like they're engaged. Yeah, basically what I was saying there is that she was betrothed, you know, or engaged, and even in that betrothal or engagement, she was considered his wife, and they would both be guilty of the act. But in verse 25 it says, but if a man find a betrothed damsel in the field, and the man force her and lie with her, in other words, rape her, then the man only that lie with her shall die. Unto the damsel thou shalt do nothing, for there is in the damsel no sin worthy of death. For as when a man riseth against his neighbor and slayeth him, even so is this matter. For he found her in the field, and the betrothed damsel cried, and there was none to save her. Right? Now the next two verses, verses 20 and 29, show us another biblical marriage. And this one is one of the two forms of biblical marriage that people will have the most problem with. So Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29. It says, if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, so he finds a girl who's not engaged and not married, and lay hold on her and lie with her, which is rape, and they be found, then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he hath humbled her, he may not put her away all his days. So, in other words, if a man rapes a woman who is not betrothed, who is not married, she is no one's wife, he rapes her and they're caught, then he has to pay the dowry, or pay the 50 shekels to her father, and she becomes his wife. Now, I think the reasons why people have a problem with that are obvious, because who wants to be the wife of their rapist, you know? But the fact of the matter is that is, by definition, a biblical marriage, right? So biblical marriage, you know, I'll just mention something here. The system, while it is a perversion of the original marriage, it is basically the most righteous thing that they could have at the time because of the corruption of their hearts. And what I mean by that is, well, okay, so he humbles her. Now it's likely that no man will want her and she'll have no one to take care of her except for her father, which it's possible too that her father could take care of her, but she would have no husband, no posterity, and the rest of it. So she was given to him, right? But even so, it's really still a tough situation, right? Like, it sounds, lots of times it's easy to look back on stuff like that as the Old Testament stuff and say, well, that was then, and this is now, and we don't really think about how serious it was. But if we really consider what it would be like to be that girl, that rape victim, and then be married to that man, you know, when you really consider that, it's pretty dreadful. It's pretty dreadful, and it's, you know, and it's important to understand, though. It's important to understand the depth of the situation in reality and how it's not what our Heavenly Family designed, right? And one of the reasons why it's important to understand that is so that we can understand that there is a big difference between what is biblical marriage and what is Edenic marriage, right? And this comes into a whole other broad topic of things which we will get into at some point, inspiration, and how inspiration necessitates accommodation, and communication in itself necessitates accommodation, and people have to be dealt with where they are at. And so that marriage, you know, of the rapist and the victim is a biblical marriage. It is according to the laws of the Bible, and therefore it is not sin. Sin being defined as transgression of the law. But it's important to realize how dreadful of a circumstance it was anyways, regardless of whether or not it was sin, simply because it's important to understand the difference between biblical marriage and Edenic marriage. And there's one other, I mean, there are multiple examples of marriage that are, you know, biblical marriage, that we won't go through all of it, but there's a couple other ones we'll read. Deuteronomy 21 talks about another form of marriage. Deuteronomy 21 verses 10 to 14. And keep in mind, this is a biblical marriage. When thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast desire unto her, thou wouldest have her to thy wife, then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head, and pare her nails, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. And after that thou shalt go in unto her, which I think we all understand, that's a euphemism for sexual intercourse. Thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. And it shall be that if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will, but thou shalt not sell her at all for money. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her. So there we have a marriage that is a biblical marriage of a man taking a captive of another nation and keeping her in her house, letting her in. Obviously, here's the thing. Obviously, she's not happy about it. Her family has just been killed. Her home is destroyed. She's now with foreign people who are going through and, from their perspective, just destroying their lives. And she's there mourning for a month. She's obviously not happy. And then after the month, the man has sex with her. And if he likes her, he'll keep her. And if he doesn't like her, he'll just let her go. Right? And that is a marriage. He takes her, he becomes her husband, she becomes his wife. And what this does, it shows two situations. One is a biblical marriage in which a captive is married to the captor, and it continues that way. Or it's a marriage that is a temporary biblical marriage because he doesn't delight in her and he lets her go. So again, the question is that the Edenic marriage? Another example of a marriage is the marriage of a servant in Exodus 21, verses 2 to 4. And we'll read it, and there's a few things here that are quite interesting. It says, "If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing." But then it says in verse 3, "If he came by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him." So if you buy him and he's a servant and he's already married, then his wife can leave with him at the end, in the 7th year. Then verse 4 says, "If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, then the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself." Right? So that's another form. Verse 4 is another form of biblical marriage. It's a temporary marriage, but it is a biblical, lawful marriage.
Oh, so the
And therefore not
master
sin.
is married now to the...
Well, it's not that the master is married to her.
Oh.
What it is that she was the servant's wife, right?
Yeah.
That he gave to her. He didn't come with her. The master gave this woman to the servant as a wife.
Yeah.
Then at the end, if they, bore children and everything, at the end of, in the 7th year of his service, he can leave, but he can't take her and the children with him.
Yeah.
He just goes, and then the master keeps them. Yeah, that's what Walter just saying. No, that's just regular slavery. That's basically what you see. And so that's another form of biblical marriage. Yeah, and Walter's pointing out the, boring his ear with the awl and everything, if he wants to stay. And that's what it talks about in the next verses. And then it talks about if he takes himself another wife, which we'll get into in a second. Now we have this whole thing of polygamy, all right? We have Exodus 21, verse 10. "If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if he do not these 3 unto her, then she shall go out free without money." So taking unto himself another wife, that's another, and this is, it's, whether the servant does or if someone else does, it applies to them too, which we see in other verses. For example, Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy 21, verse 15, it says, "If a man have 2 wives, one beloved and another hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be, when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he shall not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the hated or the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he hath. For he is the beginning of his strength, and the right of the firstborn is his." Right? So there you have, in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 21, you have polygamy as a form of biblical marriage. Right? It was not unlawful to have polygamy. And you see it also in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7 to 8. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7 and 8. This is after the whole Bathsheba incident. And Nathan just gave them the parable, and, now in verse 7, Nathan said unto David, "Thou art the man. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul." So this is the Lord speaking, right? Nathan saying, the Lord is saying this to you, David. I anointed thee king over Israel, and I have delivered thee out of the hand of Saul, and I gave thee thy master's house, and thy master's wives into thy bosom, and gave thee the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would, moreover, have given unto thee such and such things. So there we see that the Lord actually is speaking to David. He gives the message through Nathan, and part of what he says is that he gave to David the wives of Saul, right? So I'm sure that the Lord would not do something unlawful, right? So he actually gave David the wives of Saul, and that's just simply what it states. Now, I just want to kind of recap something here. So far, what we've seen is that the forms of biblical marriage include monogamy, right? You could just have one man having a wife. That's totally fine. You could have the levirate marriage. That's the second form. You have the rapist and the victim. You have the captor and the captive. You have, and that had a couple different situations, either a lifelong thing or a temporary thing. Or, what is it, Walter? Yeah, you don't have polyandry in the Bible. Polyandry is a woman with more than one man, other than successively. And that's what we see with the levirate marriage, and that's what is referenced in Romans 7. Paul talks about that and gives it as an allegory. And it's also referred to in Luke 20, Matthew 22, and we'll get to those passages. But then, so you have those marriages, you have polygamy, you have, did I mention the rapist and the victim, right? And I already mentioned the captor and the captive. You have all these different forms of marriage, and those forms have variations of the form, right? Oh, you have the servant and the given wife from the master, right? Which was a temporary thing. And you have all these forms that in the strictest sense of the term are biblical marriages and are according to the law, right? So here's kind of where the dilemma comes in, and here's how where people make the mistake, right? Most of Christianity, especially nowadays, in this whole debate over, since this whole homosexual marriage thing is coming up, and one thing that I will mention is there is a change in marriage, biblically, what happened per society. And as society changed, what was the common biblical marriage did change. And that's what we see in the book of Ruth, actually. We see them in that time of the Judges when it's kind of anarchy, and the levirate system is starting to not work as well. And by the time the book of Judges, or the book of Ruth, was written, it referred to how that practice was how they, let me see if I can just find the verse quickly here. And it talks about the whole thing with the removing of the sandal, because you had that with Boaz, and a man who was nearer of kin to Ruth. She was to, lawfully she was going to go to him, and if it wasn't her, then it was supposed to be the next nearest of kin, which was Boaz. And since he didn't, they had the whole thing with the, taking off the shoe or the sandal. And what it says is that in Ruth chapter 4, verse 7, it says, "Now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing, to confirm all things. A man plucked off a shoe and gave it to his neighbor," and the rest of that. So you had this whole thing of the removal of the shoe, which was kind of a variation of what you saw in Deuteronomy. But here, in the time the story of Ruth and Naomi happened, that was still in practice. But by the time the book of Ruth was written, it says that was the practice in former times, right? So you see that the practice of marriage, and the levirate system was changing. It was going out, and what they had more was polygyny. Polygyny is the form of polygamy, which is, one male and multiple females. Polygamy is an overall term for plural marriage, and polygyny is one male, multiple females. Polyandry is one female, multiple males. So in the time of Boaz, you see the culture was shifting. They were into this period of kind of, the judges, and things were more confused. And then after that, they went into the monarchy, where they had kings, and then polygyny became more common practice, and the wives of one king passed on to the other, and wives would take on, that's what happened with David and Saul,
yeah.
and then the kings would take and marry the daughters of other nations, or making agreements with them, and so on, and it became very common practice. Yeah, and concubines were also, we're not even going to get into that right now, but that was a lawful form of relationship. But, this is where the dilemma comes in, right? So we can see this change happening, where as society changes, what the Bible says about the common form of marriage. Once you get into the New Testament again, you have empires and all this stuff going on. And then in the New Testament, that's the time in which it has more of an emphasis on having one wife again, right? Your overseers having one wife, and deacons, which, again, if we understand it correctly, everyone in the church is a deacon. The Bible tells us that. And so it's really saying, like, everyone who is part of this community of believers in Christ should only have one wife, right? The New Testament is certainly teaching that.
And on that point right there, I know some people question whether that means, let's say you're married and your spouse dies and you remarry. Obviously, free to remarry in that case.
Yeah.
But yet they'll say, oh, well, you can't be a deacon now, because they don't understand the real definition of a deacon. But because you have had more than one wife. But what that is saying is not sequentially having more than one wife, but at one time. Is that right?
That's totally correct, yeah. And in Romans 7, even though Paul is using it as an analogy, you see that principle there. You have the, successive marriages of a woman to men, and it's lawful, especially, like, there's absolutely no question if the former partner died, right? There's absolutely no question there. And there are other things, too, where it's not that the person has to die either. There's other situations in which that can lawfully take place. But the dilemma here is that we do have this thing where it looks like the Bible is teaching a societal relative for marriages. And so you have the homosexual, quote-unquote, Christian community saying, hey, look, this is a new day and age. We don't keep the Old Testament stuff anyways. Who of you is marrying your deceased brother's wife, right? Who of you are following that law? And who of you, are doing this, and who is following the health laws? Who is keeping all these, these laws? And so they're kind of saying, hey, wait a second, and then the homosexual non-Christian community, or non-professed Christian community, is just saying, hey, wait, here you are, your Bible says that a rapist and their victim should be married, and you're telling us that gay marriage is wrong? And then the huge mistake that mostly evangelical Christianity, but religious people are making, is what they're saying is that biblical marriage is heterosexual monogamy, right? They're saying that biblical marriage is one man, one woman, that's it. Basically, what's happening there is it's because most Christians don't know how to deal with these passages, they know, like, oh wait, that can't be right. A rapist and the victim, that can't be right. or polygamy, that can't be right, or this, that can't be right. So that must not be biblical marriage, right? And that must not be, so you have this argument going, and it's basically just being misunderstood. And what we have to understand is that there is a difference between what is transgression of the law and what is immorality, right? And I'll give another example of that. And we've talked about this before, and I know I've put it on YouTube and stuff, to explain what morality is. And I've asked people, what is the basis for morality? First, I'll ask, does it make sense for morality to be arbitrary? Could morality be totally arbitrary and be a true, just, moral system? What I mean by that is, if the moral codes were just simply chosen, what that shows is that they could have been chosen to be something else, right? If you have arbitrary morality, then anything could be moral depending on who chooses what is moral and what is immoral. In other words, if you have the person that's choosing and they say that rape is moral and it's an arbitrary system, then rape would simply be moral. And that's the principle of might makes right. And that just simply isn't true, because that's, in other words, what that would imply is that anyone who has the might to do something, it makes it okay for them to do it. So that's not a real moral system. So I'll ask, I know we've talked about this before, but what is the basis for morality? Does anyone have thoughts? Maybe I'll just explain it. Yeah, Walter just said what's true. And that must be the only thing, because most Christians would say, well, God, and then you hear this in Christian debates between Christians and atheists all the time, because they say, well, if you're atheist, you don't have God, therefore you can't have morality, because God is where we get morality. But if God simply made morality, that would show that there was a time before God made morality in which it didn't exist. And God had to choose what is moral and what is immoral. So the simple truth of the matter is that if morality is based off anything, and if it's not arbitrary, it must be based off of that which is true. Because if it's not based off truth, the only other option is based off something that's not true. And if it's not true, it's not based off anything, because that which is not true is not real. It's only a lie. It's not a part of actual reality. It's just a fabrication. So a morality that's not based off of truth is a morality that is not based off anything, and something that's not based off anything can't be anything, right? I'll actually repeat this because it's important. Just talking about what is moral, right, and how the big mistake that people are making is kind of, they think that which is transgression of the law and that which is immoral are a one-to-one ratio. They're exactly the same. But if that's true, then all this stuff which we see is lawful is moral. But what we have to find is what is the basis of morality, right? And simply morality, it can't be based off of nothing, because anything that's based off of nothing is itself nothing other than fabrication, right? So if there is a such thing as morality, it must be based off of truth. Because if it's based off of anything other than truth, it has to be based off of a non-truth, which is a lie. And anything that's not true is not actually real. It's not part of reality, so it's based off nothing. So in other words, the only way to have a objective morality is for morality to be based off of truth, right? Which is why we can say that lying is immoral. Lying is wrong because it's going against reality. Because you hear people saying, well, why is lying wrong? If I tell this lie and it's not wrong, like nothing bad comes out of it, what could possibly be wrong with it? And if you don't understand the basis for morality, you're going to have a hard time explaining it to people. So another example of this is killing. Why is killing wrong? right? If we didn't understand this whole thing about morality, we would just say, well, God said not to kill. It's like, well, yeah, but then he could have said that it's okay to kill. And if it was, then okay, let's say you kill someone, now they're gone. So what? What's the big deal, right? Well, the reason why it is immoral is because they are part of reality, and what defines morality is reality. And so, and again, it has to go back to the original reality. The reason why it has to go back to the original is simply because if it's based off of the changing reality, what that would mean is that somebody killing someone, their action of killing, them doing that is bringing that action into reality. So that act of killing is then reality, and you could say, if it's based off the change in reality, that makes it moral simply because it's existing. But what that shows is that if there is a such thing as morality, and there's such thing as going against morality, then it has to be based off of the original reality. And, it's basically, Walter says original reality is love. And I would agree. And it's, it depends on how you explain it, and it's multifaceted. That's what I'll say. The original reality is multifaceted. So, again, this whole thing with killing, what that shows is that killing is immoral. However, someone who's killing someone is doing something that is immoral, even though their act of killing is now reality. But what this helps us understand is that, you have times in the Bible, and we just read it in Genesis 38, where it says, and Er did wickedness in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slayed him, right? And Onan did the same thing, and the Lord slayed him. It's like, well, what's going on? The thing is, it is not immoral to cancel out immorality. In other words, someone is killing, they are doing an immorality, then there's a moral obligation to change what they're doing because they're being destructive. And that's where it comes to this whole thing of who can judge. Because if I see someone killing, that doesn't give me the right to kill them because I may be misjudging the situation, right? But that lets you know how it is moral for God to kill, even though it is immoral. The killing itself is immoral. An example of this would be if you have a pregnant cat and then she births her litter of kittens, and they're outside, and they're just these helpless little kittens, and then this raccoon comes along, and it has rabies, and it's just tearing these kittens apart, and you're 50 feet away, and you don't have time to get there to save the kittens, but then your friend hands you a rifle, and you have the option. Either stand there and let these kittens die, or, and which would be allowing this infested being, this infested animal to live, which it will probably just go and be killing more animals, or you have to take that animal out. You have to kill that animal so that the other animals will live, right? And at that point, killing becomes moral because it is, you're canceling out the immoral active agent, right? And that's why God destroying sin is a moral thing, right? Destroying, period. Initially, all destruction was immoral, but to destroy the thing that is causing the immorality is a moral obligation that our heavenly family has, right? It's the strange act that they do not enjoy. Go ahead, Walter.
So, I guess you mentioned that quickly. You said who decides.
Yeah, who decides?
Because we're not.
Yeah, we should not try to judge that ourselves. And in other words, what I'm saying is, even though I'm saying that canceling out immorality is not immoral, that doesn't give us the right to judge when or how or to whom that should be done, right? And I want to give another example. Another example of this is animal sacrifice. Ask the question, is animal sacrifice, such as the daily burnt offerings, was that transgression of the law? No, it wasn't. Annalisa just said no. And it's clear that it wasn't because they were actually commanded to do that every day, right? So it was not transgression law. Now ask the question, was it immoral? And actually think about it, really think about it, because we have a basis for morality. Morality is not arbitrary. There's an actual basis. Is killing that animal an immoral act? Anyone? Walter says it seems so.
You know, I hate to say yes, because then that makes me saying I disagree with the law. But I will say that it sure appears that way to a lot of people, and that's the basis on which many people reject Christianity, and many Adventists are falling into this movement, this so-called quasi-message, you know, that's about God does not slay, and they're using it to throw out, you know, the whole ceremonial law and the atonement, basically.
Yeah, I know, and I know people who, in doing that, say that the ceremonial law was given by Satan and the rest of that. But I would say when we look at it in reality, that slaying of the animal was by definition an immoral thing. Now, some people may object to that, but I'll explain why that is and why that was its original intention, right? Now, here, the thing is that it's not transgression of the law. Therefore, it's not sin, right? It was according to the law. However, it was immoral because that animal was innocent and it's alive. It's in existence. So to remove that life, there was nothing that it did that would justify its destruction by moral obligation, right? So it is by definition immoral. You're going against reality. However, if we really understand this, and what the animal sacrifices typified, that was the purpose. That was the purpose, because Christ having to die for us was never supposed to be a good thing. We can praise our Heavenly Family that He did, that He went through that and allowed our act of immorality to come upon Him, right? But that doesn't mean that the thing was moral, right? But the whole point was to be immoral. And when we go back to the very first sacrifice, we can see that very clearly as well. When the first lamb, and most likely two lambs, because it had to clothe two people, when the first sacrifices were made outside of the gates of Eden, Adam and Eve were never supposed to look on that and say, well, this is just great. This is wonderful, and this is moral, and this is what we should be doing every day. No, it was to cause weeping. It was to bring them to the point of recognizing the dreadfulness of sin. It was immoral on purpose. That was the purpose and the intent of it, right? So although saying that it's immoral grinds against the way we're used to thinking of it because it's part of the law, right? When we realize that it is, you know, when we actually just consider Christ and what the sacrifices typified and what our Heavenly Family is going through on our behalf, and now what they're going through certainly isn't moral. And when we consider the very first sacrifice, those two things seem to bring it out more clearly than anything else, that it actually is an immoral thing, though intentionally so. And the reason why I give that example again is to show that there is a difference between what is according to the law and what is moral. And there's a difference between what transgresses the law and what is immoral, right? The reason why that's important to understand for the topic at hand is so that we can understand that although things like the rapist and the victim and the, you know, the captor and the captive and the temporary slave marriage and the polygamy and all these things, although none of those things are transgressions of the law, and all of them in that sense are lawful and therefore not sin, in that sense of the term, we are called to a higher principle. We are called to the original makeup of reality in terms of any given thing. So anything, when we want to know what is moral and what is immoral, we have to look at its original purpose, its original intent, and we're talking about Edenic restoration. So what we have to understand is that the marriages that were given throughout, the levirate marriage, or this marriage, or that marriage, all those different forms of marriage, are probably about 8 of them in the Bible. Those are not the original marriage. Those are not the Edenic marriage. It's a different thing. And that's what we were reading with Potter in that original statement. He was saying that the original marriage was lost and that it was forgotten what it actually was and what it wasn't. And that what Christ was pointing out in his statement, because the hardness of your heart, yeah, and that's the other thing about divorce, Christ, everything that Christ said about marriage was with the intention of pointing them back to the Edenic marriage. Everything that he said that we have recorded in the Gospels was with that intention. And what we have to understand is we are called to a higher principle. And what we have to understand, too, is that what this says is that although today we may have what are considered lawful marriages, we have to ask, is it moral? Are the marriages and the practices that we have within our marriages moral? Because we are called to something higher. For example, it is lawful for a man and a woman to be married and to not be in love and to have this union that is not based off of that original intent. That's lawful, but it's not according to the original purpose and therefore is very likely to be immoral. For example, you have marriage is a license for sex. You read Ellen White's writings and she has a lot to say about that, and how no, it's not, and how marriage is used as a covering for sin, right? And the majority of sex that happens in marriage today is actually immoral because it's not love, it's passion and it's lust, and it's, not according to the original pattern. It may be lawful, there may be nothing in the law that condemns it, but it is immoral, right? It is, and so we are called to that higher standard. We are called to have love. And, like today you have lots of situations in a marriage relationship, and you hear the classic thing of, the woman having a headache and the man wanting sex anyways, and then Ellen talks about women becoming a tool or an instrument for animal passion, right? And you have this stuff happening, and unless both partners are entering into that with total love and desire and affection for each other to uplift our heavenly family and to have that true love with one another, unless it is that, it is immoral, regardless of if it is permissible in the law, right? So again, we're called to that higher standard. So you have the extremes of people today in secular society promoting homosexual marriage and rebuking the Christians and so on because, look, the Bible says this and that and that. And you have the Christians trying to portray it as though the only biblical marriage is a man and a woman. And then you have those perhaps in Messianic communities or elsewhere in some areas of Christianity who understand that all this is biblical marriage, but they think that because it's lawful and because it's biblical, that it's therefore moral and that it's therefore what they should be doing. And that's why you have lots of people making biblical arguments for polygamy and all this. And what we need to understand is, hey, you know what? Someone can make biblical arguments and can actually prove, rightfully so, that polygamy is a form of biblical marriage and that God even gave David multiple wives, right? And you can prove that. But when we're encountering people like that, what we should be doing is, instead of trying to say, no, that's not biblical marriage, because it is, we should say, yes, that was permissible. and that is all that is according to the law. And I'm not going to say that that is unlawful. However, we are called to a higher standard because we're in the restoration of all things. And the original marriage has been lost, and it is now being restored. Right? And this is getting into the whole thing with Christ's conversation with the Sadducees. However, we've been on here for 2 hours, and I think people are getting into day leads. And I don't know if you guys, it might not actually take long. I could probably sum it up pretty quickly. Do you guys want to have a quick summary of Christ's conversation with the Sadducees? Because that's probably where most of the confusion lies with it. Or would you rather stop for now and we'll discuss that this evening and then get into, well, I'm just saying this evening. Anyone else have a say in that? Rebecca saying stop for now. Okay. I'm agreeing with that. I think we should probably stop for now. I just want to ask, though, is that I know it's kind of, it was surprising to me that our sister would be showing us that in the restoration of true marriage, that part of that would be showing us that a rapist and a victim, polygamy, and all these things are biblical marriage. You know, I wouldn't have thought, I was kind of surprised with that, but hopefully in the context of our higher calling and the difference between transgression of the law and immorality, I hope you guys can see it in its right setting. Lots of people might have a problem with it because they think that in saying that those things are biblical marriage, it's saying that it's okay. I hope you can see that's not what I'm saying, and I hope you can see that we're called to an even higher standard than what most people think of today as heterosexual monogamous marriage, because even that, the way it's conducted today is often a cloak for sin and a license for immoral sexual behavior. So we're calling for love and we're calling for restoration. Any thoughts on that? Does that make sense? Does anyone have objections or questions? Or
I think it's what's standing out clearer is that the law is just given, and it's in the Bible, it's given as the best that can be done, but it's not stating the highest.
It's not stating the highest principle. And Paul said that the law was for the wicked. Law was given for the wicked, you know. Because if we were living on the principles of our heavenly family, all that stuff would be unnecessary. Right?
As I said, the angels never thought about it. They just lived the law.
Yeah.
Law of love.
Law of love. So this afternoon we can discuss this a little bit more, and perhaps we won't even get into justification by faith until tomorrow. But we'll see.
Trent?
Yeah?
Yeah, I do have a comment.
Yeah?
This is really huge, and I'm thinking that, you know, there are lots of questions that are going through my mind, like, well then, why would God make it so obvious that He originates a law that's immoral? And I can just see this as opening the Pandora's box on that whole thing of, you know, how can I serve a God that would, you know, allow killing and, you know, and having to, you know, being forced to live with a rapist, and, you know, there are hundreds of different examples that people can dredge up. And, you know I've spent most of my Christian life thinking that I was supposed to look down on those people because we're just supposed to blindly, you know, serve this God, you know, whether it makes sense or not. And I'm thinking, wow, isn't this great that the Lords are actually telling us some things that's going to vindicate their character. These types of things will vindicate their character, because I can't go one-on-one with my intellectual thinking friends that didn't grow up having religion crammed down their throat and being taught that they were supposed to blindly follow anything, you know?
Right.
And so this is fabulous to me. I'm just jumping for joy.
Amen. Praise our Heavenly Family. It is really important, because it's, you know, and this truly is the true character of God message, you know?
Yeah.
in its right setting. It's showing the character of our Heavenly Family. And we will understand this better it's been something for months now that has been on my mind that we need to discuss. It's just this whole topic of inspiration and this concept of accommodation in communication is so important to understand, and that's where we get a lot of this, a lot of these pictures. And you see Christ doing it, when he called the Samaritan woman a dog. He was showing the disciples their attitude. That's an example. It's slightly different than this, but it's showing that example of using accommodation. And Walter pointed out, he used the parable of Lazarus and Abraham, and showing that communicating with people where they're at and bringing them as high as you possibly can at that point where their mind is at. And so it's kind of, but yeah, this is something to understand. It's very important to understand, and it's something to think about, something to pray about. And it does answer a lot of things. The whole problem of suffering, people say, oh, how can God be real if we have this problem of suffering? This is part of that answer. Everything our Heavenly Family has been revealing is part of that, though, in terms of the wicked gods and the rulership in the, under the nations and so on. That's all part of the picture as well. But yeah, just praise our Heavenly Family. Our sister has been very kind every week to be giving us new food to eat on. So, thank you so much, Heavenly Family, for being so gracious and so kind. Did anyone else have anything to say in regards to this? Or if not, just praising our Heavenly Family. If anyone wants to close off with prayer.
No, it was a real blessing, even having heard some of this already, a lot of it. Just the knowledge of the intense love that our Heavenly Family has for us, and finding ways to try to provide for people even in a sinful world, because they don't force us to do anything. So they made a law as righteous as could possibly be in the conditions of men of the day to provide for these people who were, some of them were abused or really used poorly. And rather than being an occasion for criticizing, it's really just another evidence of their love.
Amen. You were going to say something, Tim?
Just in the light of, we're looking for the marriage of the Lamb, and then which would be, I guess so many thoughts are just swirling through my mind, but the idea of it, that would they be the first of this marriage of the new kind? Right,
interestingly enough, I'll put it like this. There is a few ways to look at, you know how we read the passage where those who were betrothed were already considered married? So in that sense, yes. In that sense, yes. In another sense, not quite, but, and there may be others who may have that experience before they are able to be physically together on a constant basis. However, what is to be understood is that, it's the true Edenic marriage. It has no ceremony. It's not something that two people choose for themselves. It's something that our Heavenly Family makes people and creates them fit for each other and inspires the love in them for one another. And they simply are. And that's the Edenic marriage. That's when we get into this whole thing tonight with marrying and giving marriage and what Christ was talking about with the Sadducees. It'll become really clear what is being said, you know.
So again, it's the same theme that we've been correlating in the last few months, is just the broadening our definition of reality again, to seeing what is a real marriage, the real, you know. So it's
Certainly,
you know, getting out of the virtual and getting into the real.
yeah. And the other thing that I should mention, and tonight we'll get into this a little bit more, of how this relates to the resurrection. Both, you know, Christ spoke of it in terms of the resurrection, literally speaking, but there's also this other, he comments about being made children of God and so on. And there's some certain aspects there that this true Edenic marriage cannot really happen if we're still, in other words, if we're slaves of Satan, we're in his system, and we're not going to be able to really experience the institutions that our heavenly family has to offer. But if we have Christ as our master, right, die to self, receive life, then we won't be experiencing the devil's institutions and his perversions. We will be experiencing the, you know, restored marriage and restored everything else, restored Sabbath, and all of that.